Thank you all for watching again. I guess you don't really have to watch, but it's kind of a requirement to at least get some of the information that you may need, either watching or hearing some of these lectures. But this is chapter number 9. This is Principles of Exercise Training. I'll start off by going over some definitional stuff. Definitional? I don't know if definitional is a word. I use it quite a bit, though, I believe. But anyway, over some definitions, some terminology, and also getting into some of the principles of exercise training. That's kind of like the main aspect of it. Go into quite a few of them. Maybe some concepts of free weights versus machines, some hypertrophy stuff, periodization, eccentric exercises, the variable resistance types of training, plyometrics, kind of a fun one there. Just kind of some aspects too of anaerobic and aerobic performance training, and then also high intensity interval training to kind of sum up, or at least the end of the chapter. So without further ado, here is chapter number 9. Chapter number 9, Principles of Exercise Training. So to start off this fun-filled chapter, let's look at some definitions. Some of these you've probably seen before, or at least heard of before, but let's look at some of the definitions, maybe discuss some of them. Muscular strength. So this is the maximal amount of force that a muscle or a group of muscles that can generate to move the joint or to move a certain limb. And it's often measured a lot of times through a 1 repetition maximum, or what's known as a 1 RM. So maxing out, which is every Monday, at least for the bench press anyway. That's International Bench Press Day, Monday. Now, some people will use strength and power interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same. They're related, but they're certainly not the same. Muscular power has a time factor into it. So the power is equal to the force, so the actual amount of weight that is being moved times the distance that it's being moved. And then you divide that by the time it took to actually move that weight that certain distance. So it has that time factor. So if there is an equal amount of weight and distance that someone was able to move a certain weight, but they were able to do it in a shorter period of time than somebody else, they have more muscular power. Those two individuals have the same amount of strength, but their power is different. And then muscular endurance is just simply sustained, repeatable muscular contractions over a period of time. And a lot of times this is represented through a percentage of 1 repetition maximum. So how many times can you bench press or maybe squat or whatever the exercise may be, like 50% of your 1 repetition maximum. A couple other definitions that we've kind of touched on throughout the semester. Aerobic power and capacity. This is VO2 max, VO2 testing, and it's limited by the cardiovascular system. On the other side of things, on the anaerobic side, you get power of the anaerobic system. And the best way to measure that is really the Wingate cycle test. So again, this is pure anaerobic power, like sprint performance. If we're looking at strength or muscular endurance or power, usually we're going to use a bench press, a deadlift, a squat, something like that. Now let's look at some training principles. The first one here is principles of individuality. So this is stating that each person is actually going to respond a little bit different than the next person. Genetics plays a major role in how someone was going to respond to certain training principles and certain training regimens. Even if they're identical twins, they're each going to respond ever so slightly different. And if they're not identical twins and they're born of completely different parents, they're certainly going to respond maybe fairly similarly, but they're not going to be exactly the same. So you really want a program design that's individualized for each person. When you're taking an entire team, say a football team, you're going to have athletes like running backs that are going to need a certain program. And then you're going to have maybe the center is going to need a different program just based upon their certain positions. If you put those two in the exact same program, they might respond similarly, but they're going to respond differently because they're completely different individuals. But they also need some sort of specific program. That leads into the specificity, and that's the adaptations for a specific mode or intensity. And you're really trying to stress the relevant muscles and the relevant groups. An example of this, and this is somewhat obvious of an example, is that if you're training for bench press, you want to maximize your bench press and try to get it up to 300 or 400 pounds. Probably the worst way to do that would be to every day run 5 miles. Not to say you're not going to gain maybe some sort of strength, or at least capability of increasing strength somehow because you're being a little bit more active. However, you're not maximizing and stressing the muscles that you need for the bench press in that case. If you are wanting to become a world-class sprinter, same thing. You don't run a marathon every single day. If you're wanting to become a marathon runner, if all you're doing every day is just toe raises and that's it, then you're certainly not going to be able to maximize your time efficiency and your cardiovascular endurance for that specific event. Those are somewhat obvious examples, but you start to get into some of the nitty-gritty aspects of it, to where maybe it's something like instead of doing a bench press for a football lineman, you would maybe have a machine where somebody could stand up and do a chest press moving forward as they're moving their legs. That's the same exact movement that they would be performing during their actual sport. So that's really a very specific movement. Now, it's not to say that bench press is worthless, or maybe something like a squat or whatever is not beneficial, but getting into some of those specific movements and training the specific muscles and the specific movements for those muscles is much more beneficial, especially for athletics. The next one here is the principle of reversibility. Simply put, if you do not use it, you will lose it. So any gains that somebody has had can actually be lost with either a decrease in training, or if they stopped for whatever reason. Could be an injury, could be life happens, whatever it might be, could be COVID, whatever it may be that is going on in somebody's life. For whatever reason, they slowed down or stopped, they can lose their gains. And that will happen. The body is going to try to maintain as much as it can, but it will not maintain everything, because it is only going to keep the adaptations that it is required of it on a daily basis, or at least maybe even somewhat weekly. You don't have to actually train at a certain intensity every single day to keep those. In fact, that might be disadvantageous, but you need to be able to keep up with the workout to be able to keep up with those adaptations. Now, this can be done because somebody's wanting to detrain. A lot of NFL linemen will do that. A lot of professional athletes will do that after they are retired. Even if they're still maybe at a young age, maybe in their early 30s, they will essentially lose some of the muscle mass on purpose because they don't need that muscle mass anymore. They might start training a little bit more cardiovascular training, lose a little bit of weight, a little bit of fat mass that maybe they gain specific for their sport. Some bodybuilders will do this after they retire. They still work out, still train really hard, but they don't need that huge muscle mass anymore. So they will detrain the body and lose some of that muscle mass on purpose. And the next one is the principle of progressive overload. This is arguably the most important to understand, in that the only way to increase your performance, increase your strength, your power, your muscular endurance, is to increase stress on the body. There's no way around it. You have to increase stress for some type of improvement. So as strength increases, the resistance must also increase to increase the strength. If you want to increase muscular endurance, you have to either increase the weight and the repetitions, or at least increase the repetitions moving forward, because you need additional stress to have any other type of further adaptation moving forward. Now, there is a principle that kind of describes this progressive overload. It's known as the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS, G-A-S. If you're listening on your headphones, you might want to look at some point the General Adaptation Syndrome, and you can even Google it, look it up. There's a couple of different more specific graphs or figures to it, but I do have the more simplistic one in the PowerPoint, and those of you watching the video are actually seeing it right now. So on the x-axis, we have time, and we have performance on the y-axis. So let's say we started off weight training within the first couple days, you're going to have what's known as an alarm phase. And this is going to be a reaction from the body saying, whoa, what just happened? What just happened? The muscles are going to start to, well, they are going to be broken down because of some of the movements that we were performing. We're putting a lot of stress, new stress on the muscles and the muscle tissues. And after a couple days, we're going to start to feel a little bit sore. And that's that delayed onset muscle soreness that you may feel starting a weight training program. During that period of time, performance actually decreases. Some of that's because of the pain, and depending upon your pain tolerance, it may decrease a little bit further than some people. It may not decrease all that much, just depending upon the individual. But it will decrease, at least slightly. Now, once the body starts reacting to that, it starts clearing up some of the debris, some of the stuff that's built up in the muscles from that injury that you essentially cause within the muscles, and it heals itself. And that's where we get into the resistance phase. So we start building the tissues up bigger, stronger than what they were prior to starting the weight training activity. And then once you start to get into that resistance phase, you're going to be massively increasing your performance, whether that be strength or muscular endurance, whatever it may be. And then the body's going to adapt to that and plateau. As long as you continue to do the same exact thing day after day or week after week, there's going to be a plateau. The only way to get past that plateau is to have some increase in reps, sets, weight, whatever it might be. So you may have another little alarm phase, and then there'll be another resistance phase, and you can kind of keep on going up until you reach essentially your genetic potential. Now, what we want to try to avoid is the exhaustion phase, doing the same thing every day, every week, every year. It can get a little bit boring. That's where you start getting into burnout, staleness, and maybe even fatigue, where the body just starts to break down because you're doing the same exact things. Maybe you're not training properly. Maybe it's just you're not stimulating the right muscles. You are not doing whatever it might be to need to get that muscle to stimulate to increase its size or strength. Some of this could also be psychological as well, that staleness and burnout that we talk about. Okay, the next principle I want to discuss is the principle of periodization. There are textbooks that are dedicated to this. I'm just going to cover the basics of it. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Again, you can spend almost a whole semester or a whole year looking at this. But basically, you're just trying to change the variables, the mode, the volume, and the intensity to maximize the time that you have available, and also to try to avoid exhaustion and overtraining. So in the PowerPoint, it gives a very good representation of how this should look. So we have 4 different phases here. We have the preparatory period, the transitional period, competition period, and the transition period or active rest. The preparatory period is the off season, somewhat leading into then the transition period, which is the preseason. And then the competition period is during the actual season, and then postseason or after the season, literally after the season ends, then you start going into the transitional period of active rest. Now we have volume, intensity, and technique that are involved in all of this. The volume, if you're in the off season, you're not spending a lot of time during practice. So you can dedicate a lot of time to the training in the gym. It could be running, whatever the sport may be, but you're taking a lot of time into that type of training. But as you get closer and closer to the season, that has to decrease because you're spending maybe a couple hours, 2, 3, possibly even 4 hours dedicated to actual practice and drills for that particular sport. Let's take a sport like basketball, for example. In the off season, yes, you're certainly going to be doing some drills, maybe working on some of your technique, your shot, some dribbling drills, whatever it might be. But you're dedicating also a lot of time to the weight room, maybe to some sprints. But as we start to get closer and closer to the season and getting into the preseason, and especially during the competition period during the season, the technique period, the practice time, and also the competition time, the actual time you're spending during a game is increasing. So there's not enough time to spend in the gym. So you need to maximize the time that you're able to get in there. And that's where the intensity needs to come into play. The intensity needs to increase as technique increases, because the volume, the actual time spent in the gym, and we're talking about the weight room gym in this case, is decreasing. So more weight, less reps, so more intense workouts. But the technique is going to rise. And hopefully that peaks then towards the end of the season, going into the postseason. Then after the season ends, championship game, whatever it might be, then there could be an active rest period where there's still some workouts going on, but it's kind of like a detraining phase. And maybe even just taking a week or two off and then going back into increasing the volume. The technique training is going to be decreasing at the same time, and the intensity can also decrease at the same time as well. Now, these can be broken up into different cycles. Macro cycles could be maybe an entire year. Mesocycles are several weeks, could be maybe 1 or 2 weeks. And then a microcycle was usually represented for a week or maybe a couple days. So we're really looking at what should the volume, intensity, and the technique be during each of those cycles. Looking at resistance training and how to optimize either strength, power, hypertrophy, increase in muscle size, and also muscular endurance. Training large groups before small muscle groups is much more beneficial, because the large muscle groups are going to tire somebody out more. Those exercises that require large muscle groups are going to tire somebody out a little bit more. So if you're performing the small muscle group exercises before the large muscle group exercises, might be a little bit more tired once you get to those larger muscle group exercises. So for instance, bench press. You can do bicep curls or maybe tricep extensions before performing a bench press, but it might not be advantageous for maximizing that bench press workout, because the agonist and antagonist muscles are going to be a little bit more tired. Some of the synergistic muscles could actually be tired as well, and some of the stabilizer muscles could be fatigued. So that could actually cause potentially an increased risk for injury. And the multi-joint before single. And this is relating back to the large muscle group exercises versus the small muscle group exercises. Something like a tricep extension or bicep curl is a single joint exercise. At least it should be if performing it properly. Multi-joint would be like a bench press, squat, deadlift. So you're wanting to use those highly intense exercises before the lower intensity exercises like single joint. Now, in terms of the rest period, maybe 2 or 3 minutes for beginners, and then 1 to 2 minutes for advanced. And depending upon what you're trying to do, could even be a little bit lower than that, maybe even 30 seconds, 45 seconds. Now, there's a figure here that I'll try to sum up in case you are just listening to this, in that it's looking at strength, power, hypertrophy, and muscular endurance, and what the repetition maximum range is. Essentially, what's going on is that to maximize strength and power gains, most of the sets that you want to do is between 2 and maybe 5 or 6 repetitions. If you want to maximize hypertrophy, pretty much between 8 to 12 repetitions, and then muscular endurance, really that 13, 14 up to maybe 20 repetitions. You can maybe go a little bit more than that. How much more beneficial 25 or 30 repetitions is could be maybe up for debate. But anything more than at least 12 or 13 is certainly going to be more advantageous for muscular endurance than it would be for something like strength and power output. In terms of some of the research that's gone into hypertrophy, a lot of this was done on bodybuilders. 8 to 12 repetitions, 3 to 4 sets for each exercise. That tends to be the best parameters for building muscle mass, so increasing the size of the muscle fiber. And let's get into the old school debate of free weights versus machines. I say old school because it's been around a while, this argument. However, it's still relevant. Do you want to train with free weights or you want to train with machines? Some of the benefits of the free weights is that the resistance remains constant. There's a little bit more motor unit recruitment with free weights, just because you have some stabilizer muscles. You have to balance yourself a little bit. It's maybe a little bit more sport specific. I mean, if you think about a bicep curl, barbell curl, if you're standing up, not only are you using the biceps, but you're holding onto the weight. You're trying to stabilize your back at the same time. You're trying to maintain your balance. So it really is a whole body exercise. It might not be as intense as, say, a deadlift or a power clean, but it's still a whole body exercise. You're still working a lot of those stabilizer muscles to keep you upright because you're kind of unbalanced right now. You have this big weight out in front of you and you're moving it around. So you still have to balance yourself. Now, the downside to this, the free weights that is that it is limited by the weakest point. Every joint is going to have a weak point, and this is based upon the biomechanics of the body, but also the structural components of the muscles. In that a muscle that is slightly stretched is going to have more capability of muscular force production. And when you maximize the distance from the axis of rotation to the insertion of the muscle, you will actually increase the amount of torque you're able to produce. So let's look at the bicep curl. Down at the bottom, if it was fully extended, you're at about 180 degrees. And there's a picture here of a young man that's standing here doing a bicep curl. And you got 71% down at the bottom, 95% at about 140 degrees, 120 degrees, you're at 98%, 100 degrees, you're at 100%, and then 60 degrees, you're at 67%. What this is representing is obviously the joint angle, but also the maximum amount of force production capable at each one of those angles. So at about 100 degrees, that's where the max point is in this particular movement. And that's almost for everybody based upon the structural component of the muscles and also of the biomechanics of the muscles. Now, the weak point is about 60 degrees. And if you've ever done a bicep curl and you get almost to the top, you've almost curled the entire weight up, but you just can't go like that last 5 or 10 degrees, that's why. That is the weak point of that particular movement. Bench press kind of has a similar one. It's almost at the top, but you still just need maybe 3 or 4 more inches to press up, just those last few degrees, and you just can't get it. Well, that's the weak point of that particular movement. So your 1 repetition maximum is the maximum amount of weight that you can move through that weak point. So that's the downside of the free weights. Now for machines, these are really good for novice individuals. They are fairly safe. Not to say that there aren't some issues that could go awry, but they are fairly safe. And you can also have variable resistance with some certain machines. Now, these are technical machines. They're more specialized, but some machines you can have variable resistance. The other benefit of machines, depending upon what the machine is, if it's some sort of like Nautilus or home workout machine, maybe like a Bowflex, you could do multiple exercises on that one specific machine. And you just got this one unit that is kind of together, where if you wanted a full-fledged weight room in your house, your garage, or wherever it might be, your basement maybe, you need to buy pretty much a dumbbell set. You need to buy a barbell, maybe a couple barbells, a bunch of weights for those dumbbells or for those barbells. And you need the different pieces. If you want to do an incline and a decline bench, you need to have a bench that can either go up and down and then also lay flat. You need a squat rack. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you might need for free weights. But if you want to do a machine that could do multiple exercises, then that could be beneficial, especially for somebody who is, again, just a novice, just somebody who wants to stay in shape, somebody who doesn't necessarily care about benching 300 pounds. That's perfectly fine. Getting into a little bit more of the resistance training, there is a specific training method known as eccentric training. So sometimes this is referred to as negatives. So you're going to have a partner most of the time lift the weight for you during the concentric phase, and then you're going to control the weight down during the eccentric phase. Now, what this does is it helps to take advantage of the force velocity curve, meaning that you can produce more muscular force during the eccentric phase. So you're able to lift a little bit more weight during this certain type of training. Now, it's not the only training that you should do. You should also have the concentric side of things, because that's where you're going to have more and more gains. But having a negative day every once in a while is going to be beneficial, because that is going to cause a little bit more muscular damage, which causes more reaction to build the muscles up a little bit bigger. Now, in the past couple of decades, there have been a lot of different techniques to try to maybe increase the variable resistance, even with free weights, just not machines, but also free weights. So in this, the resistance is decreased at the weak point, but also increased at the strong point. So some of these could be maybe resistance bands, certain types of machines that are developed, maybe use of chains on a barbell, or maybe even a dumbbell. But these have been used for variable resistance training, and these do actually work. A lot of strength and conditioning coaches will employ these quite a bit. Now, no talk about resistance training can be complete without talking about isometric training. And sometimes isometric training has, at least the idea of it, has gone awry. So isometric training is what it sounds like. You are training the body and training the muscles in a static way, in that there's contraction, but there's no movement back and forth. No movement concentrically or eccentrically is what I'm trying to say. Now, it can be important for rehab to try to reduce the atrophy. So it's not to say that this type of training is absolutely useless. It does have a use, but it has maybe a more limited or specific use for it. This was actually really popular back in the 70s. And the reason was because there was a study that had come out saying that the isometric contraction and the isometric training was just as beneficial as the dynamic type of training, which is the concentric and eccentric together. So people got on the bandwagon. They started to perform the static contractions in the isometric training. And there was also some other researchers that were saying, hey, let's try to reproduce some of these results, which is what you do in science. Anytime somebody comes out with a claim based upon data that they collected, you test it and retest it. And if they're wrong, they're wrong. If they're right, they're right. And you just build upon the evidence. The problem is that when this study came out and people started to try to reproduce the results, they were unable to, and nobody has been able to since. So whatever happened during that initial study, nobody necessarily knows, but we do know now that no, isometric training is not just as beneficial as the dynamic exercises. Dynamic exercises, the concentric, the eccentric, that's going to be the most beneficial. Now, you could also have something known as isokinetic training, where the speed actually remains constant. So the angular velocity moving that particular machine and that joint angle was going to remain pretty constant. But what happens here is you're maximally producing force throughout the entire range of motion. So if we go back to the bicep curl, maybe at 100 degrees, you're able to produce 100% of the weight that you're able to lift during that particular joint angle. But at that 67 degrees or 60 degrees, whatever it may be, then that's the weak point. You don't have to produce 100% of whatever it was at 100 degrees. So you're able to maximize the force production throughout the entire range of movement. The downside to some type of training like this is that it's a very specialized piece of equipment. And that's the largest downside to it. And sometimes they're pretty expensive, and they're very specific for rehabilitation usually. If anybody has ever been in athletics, you know about plyometric training. So this is taking advantage of the stretch shortening cycle of the muscle. In essence, you're kind of cheating. Kind of. You're not really, but you're kind of. There's an elastic energy in the musculotendinous components of the muscles. So they are increased during rapid stretch. And there's elastic energy that's released then during the concentric phase of that contraction, of that movement. So you're really taking this and making a spring, the series elastic component, or what's known as the SEC. You're really coiling up the spring, and then you're releasing it during the concentric phase. So you're taking advantage of those springiness components and principles of the muscles, and also some of the connective tissues as well, which is the same thing people do when they do some cheating during bench press, or could be whatever exercise it might be, where they're moving really, really quickly. Now, the only way you're going to be able to take advantage of this is for the concentric movement to actually be pretty quick. It needs to be immediate, because if not, that energy is then going to be lost if it's not immediate. So doing any type of box jumps, or maybe one-legged hops, or box drills, whatever it might be, quick hands. There's a whole bunch of different types of plyometric training that you can do, but it needs to be quick. And that's really the goal of it, is to increase quickness. And continuing on here, last little bit of resistance training, talking about core stability and strength. Core stability is very important, not just for athletes, but for everybody. So it just provides better stability and transfer the forces to the extremities as we're walking, running, going up and down stairs, doing just daily activities, just not athletics again. And it also helps to improve the biomechanical efficiency, so there's less wasted movement. An example I can give of this is if you've ever seen somebody run with their hands way out to their sides, their heads upward, their heads bobbing back and forth, legs are flailing. That's not very biomechanically efficient. If the core was a little bit more stable and they did not do all those different wacky things with their appendages, they would be able to move straight forward. And strengthening the core is going to help with that. This also helps to reduce the risk for injury as well, because you're able to balance the self back up, maybe from an external force that hit you, or maybe you tripped, and instead of falling, you're able to recover from it and remain upright. Now, the core is made up of type 1 muscle fibers. Abdominal muscles are not made up of some type of super muscle fiber, whatever it might be from outer space. They are just simple type 1 muscle fibers. They're going to respond to a little bit more high reps, and we're not talking about 10,000 crunches per day. 15 to 20 repetitions, 3 to 4 sets, maybe up to 5 or 6 sets, maybe add a little bit of weight to it, and they're going to respond perfectly fine. You don't need to do 350 crunches each morning, or 500 crunches, or whatever somebody does. It's not to say that that won't be beneficial in some way, but it's not necessary. So everybody has a six-pack. It just matters whether or not you have a little bit of fat over top of it or not. And I always make that point. So there we go. I'm just going to leave it there. All right, switching gears here to a little bit more anaerobic and aerobic power performances. Interval training, this is bouts of high to moderate intensity with maybe some rest, or at least reduced intensity somewhere in this training. So the benefit of this is there can be a greater volume of exercise because of those small breaks that somebody has, and you're able to maximize the intensity during the actual interval times. So this can be broken up into reps, sets, distance, time, whatever the interval is, whatever the rest period is. So for example, you could have 6 sets of 400 meters at 75 seconds. So that's how long that 400 meters needs to be run in. And then between those 400 meters, somebody might jog for 90 seconds, or might walk for 90 seconds, or they could just simply rest for 90 seconds. Now, some of this could be specific for the sport, or we get into the specificity aspect of it. It can be something like football. If you look at a football game in plays, they might last 5 or 10 seconds at the most. So maybe a 10-second sprint, and then maybe a light jog for 10 or 15 seconds, and then another sprint, and then light jog. So that's the reason for the wind sprints a lot of times at the end of practice that people will go through in sports like football and also soccer, field hockey, whatnot, is that there's a lot of anaerobic performance in that. So they want to maximize that type of training by doing some type of interval training. Now, the intensity, a lot of times it can be based upon heart rate max, or it could just be a specific duration like sprints. At the end of any exercise, there should be an active recovery. This is a low intensity. It could be simply walking or jogging. So trained individuals may need to increase intensity of the interval and then decrease the recovery time just to maximize the amount of time that they need for that specific training. But somebody who is untrained, they might need a little bit longer rest period during those intervals. Let's talk about some drugs, man. A little bit of LSD, man. Yeah. All right. Sorry. Continuous training or long, slow distance. Yes, also known as LSD. So this is without intervals. There's no breaks. This is purely aerobic. It's oxidative system. They're usually lower intensities, low to moderate, maybe moderate to high, depending upon how trained the individual is. So there's less cardiorespiratory stress, but you're still gaining some of the benefits of cardiovascular endurance training. The downside to this type of training is that, one, it takes a longer period of time, but also there's more joint and muscle stress, especially on maybe the knees, could be the hips too, the back, and also the feet. And some of that depends upon the types of shoes somebody's wearing, how old the individual is, and also what type of surfaces they're running over. For overall aerobic endurance, this is the bee's knees. Continuous training, it's very good. It improves heart health, and it is very specific for somebody who is running long distance events. And we already talked about drugs. Let's talk about farts. And this one actually sounds even more disgusting, but Fartlek training. Every semester I go over Fartlek training, and it gets funnier and funnier every semester. Fartlek training is high speed to a jog, but this is the athlete's discretion. They don't have to do it. They can do it whenever they want to. You can look at this as the libertarian training, the libertarian type of training. Yeah, if you want to go run up that hill, run up the hill. And then if you want to stop for a second, go ahead and stop for a second. It's just kind of whatever you want to do. So there's some interval, but also continuous components mixed in with the Fartlek training. Now, there could be something too, like an interval circuit type of training, maybe where it's more long distance circuit. And then there's maybe stations every so often, maybe a mile or a quarter mile up to a mile, possibly, where there's maybe a jog, run, maybe sprint at each station. Could be even some strength and flexibility type of exercises at each of these stations. This is where some of the events can get a little bit more creative in it. And the last type of training I want to talk about here is high intensity interval training, or HIIT. This is the new sexy in training, high intensity interval training. There is a big improvement in VO2 max in untrained people with this, and also trained individuals have an increase in VO2 max. Even people who are trained aerobically, and they do a lot of LSD type of training, that continuous training, if they incorporate some of this, 10% of their training time into high intensity interval training, they are actually improving not only their times, but they're improving their VO2 max. The other benefit to it is they're also improving their lactate threshold, which is more important than VO2 max. So this type of training involves maybe 4 to 6, could be more sets of maybe 30 seconds. I've seen up to maybe a minute and a half. And this is a sprint. This is just almost a full-on out sprint. Could be on a treadmill, could be outside, could be on a bike, whatever it might be. And then there's a few minutes of rest. And that rest period is going to be dependent upon how you want to train. It could be you want to try to maximize your lactate threshold, maybe bring it down a little bit. Now, this is very beneficial for people who have busy schedules, because the benefit of increasing VO2 max, but also we're starting to see that the heart health is also increasing as well. People are also losing weight with this because they're obviously burning calories. They're getting their heart rate up. So the heart health is there. And it only takes 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes to do this type of workout. Do it a few days a week, and you can improve your health. So this type of training can be performed by somebody who just does not have a lot of time, or at least uses that excuse all the times of they don't have enough time to exercise. All right, that was chapter number 9. I will see you here in a second to kind of go over the wrap up. So in this chapter, we talked about gas. We talked about drugs and hallucinogenics and also eating farts. Oh, wait a minute. No. Never mind. General adaptation syndrome, LSD training or long, slow distance training, and then also Fartlek training. Yes, that is how you pronounce it. And I always make those jokes every year. We got to have it a little bit light in these chapters, right? Sometimes it can get a little bit boring, but 3 concepts that we went over in the chapters, very important. I don't want to go over too much of like the terminology type of stuff, but the one thing I do want to touch on is the principle of progressive overload and then leading into the general adaptation syndrome. A lot of times you think of a syndrome as some type of negative thing that happens, but this is a positive response of the body, at least for the most part. At the beginning, there's a negative response where we're decreasing performance because of that alarm phase, but eventually, as long as we continue the workout, it's not like you do it once and then all of a sudden you are resistant to that type of force or stress you're placing on the body. It needs to be repetitive. So 2 or 3 times per week, it needs to happen to where you're putting that type of stress on the body, and then the body will respond. Those specific muscles will respond to that type of training, then increase the performance then. Now that was the graph that I showed, or the figure for it. That was a really general graph for the general adaptation syndrome. There are some more specific ones and maybe a little bit more detailed, but to get any type of additional increase at the start of that plateau, or if someone is plateaued, there needs to be some other difference in training. That progressive overload needs to occur. Shocking the body. You need to have an additional reps or additional sets or more weight or change something up. There needs to be something different. If it's exactly the same thing every single time, that's what the body is going to be adapted to, and you're putting the stress on it, so you're going to be able to maintain at least most of what you've gained, but there still needs to be some type of overload that occurs for any more type of gain in performance to happen. And if that doesn't happen, that progressive overload doesn't happen, then there's going to be a plateau. And if you're doing the same exact thing, or somebody's doing the same exact thing day after day, week after week, year after year, then they're going to start to maybe get a little bit psychologically fatigued from that. And that's where some of that staleness and burnout could occur. Now, some physiological and physical decrements could also occur through overtraining, but a lot of times it's psychological. People get bored with certain workouts, certain types of training, certain exercises. So changing it up every once in a while is certainly helpful for that. We did go into some of the interval types of training. There are a lot of individuals that will go through the interval training and actually have specific sets, reps, distance that they're doing. A lot of times, though, there's more of a fartlek type of training that's going on. It's more of a discretionary workout where there's a certain amount of maybe sprints or long distance running they want to do, but there could be times where they sprint for a little bit or they rest for a certain period of time. And it's just based upon the individual, how they're needing to train, what their goals are. The book certainly goes into a little bit more detail about some of that type of stuff, the interval training, than a lot of people maybe do. Some people just have a goal. I want to get to my heart rate percentage or percentage of my max heart rate, or they have a range of heart rate where they want to be during that interval. And once they get to that, they'll be there for, a certain period of time, and then they'll stop, or they'll reduce the intensity for a little bit, and then they'll start again and get the heart rate back up. So there's a lot of different ways of doing it. It's just based upon what the specifics are of how somebody wants to train, what the goals are for that. So, and continuous training, that LSD training, the biggest downside to it is it does take a little bit more time than something like maybe high intensity interval training or maybe just regular interval training, but it is certainly the biggest one for aerobic cardiovascular endurance. I mean, it's just, it's the one that we do the most for it. Even though high intensity interval training is still beneficial for it, that's still the one that is most popular. The biggest downside, other than the time, is there's more stress on the body. And some of that is, again, dependent upon the individual, how well their joints are, but also where they're running. If they're constantly running on asphalt, really hard surfaces, and they never buy new pairs of shoes, then yeah, it's going to put a little bit more stress on some of those joints, especially the knees, and possibly even the lower back as well. But as long as they keep up with their equipment, and maybe they're cushioning the feet somehow, maybe even changing up running on a treadmill every once in a while, to help eliminate some of the stress on some of the joints, then they should be fine. And the high intensity interval training, I always make the joke that everyone's so big on high intensity interval training. I want to do super high intensity interval training, or SHIIT. Shit. Anyway, high intensity interval training. This is basically sprint training, and you have a little bit of rest in between. So it's a concept that's kind of been around a while, but we've just kind of we've kind of coined the phrase here in the past decade and a half or so. And we're starting to see a lot of the research showing that it's beneficial for increase in VO2 max quite a bit, actually, and also lactate threshold, but there's starting to be some heart health that's showing as well from this. So it's beneficial for people who don't have a lot of time. They want to maximize their time, and they want to get in the gym. All they have is 15 or 20 minutes. Bam, they can get a good workout in, do the sprint training. If you've ever done it though, you know that it sucks. It is a hard type of training. I mean, you're going full force, balls of the walls for those 30 seconds, a minute. It could be 45 seconds. I have seen up to maybe 2 minutes of this, but it's not 100% intensity. It's like 90 or 95%. So you can kind of do it that way if you would like to, if you want to try this type of training. But it is intense. And then you rest for a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, depending upon what the goals are. But you get a workout done pretty quick, 10, 15 minutes. So that's certainly an option. Maybe not for somebody who is older. The intensity might be a little bit too much for them, just depending upon what their status is, health status. But anyway, that was that. So that was chapter number 9, right? No, chapter number 9, Principles of Exercise Training. Kind of a basic chapter, kind of an intro to some of the types of training that we do, from the anaerobic side, the pure anaerobic side of weight training, and then the anaerobic type of more sprinting side of things, and then the aerobic side. So these 3 chapters, 9, 10, and 11, they're really looking at the practical application of some of the stuff that we've touched on throughout the semester. And that's why I really love these chapters. They're starting getting into the meat and potatoes of, the good stuff, the fat that's around the steak, the stuff that's nice and juicy. So anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but I do have my coffee. It's early in the morning. I'm making a bunch of videos. So I thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you are listening, I hope everything is going well. And if you have any questions about chapter number 9, Principles of Exercise Training, please let me know. If not, I will see you on the flip side. And that flip side will likely be chapter number 10 if you're going in chronological order. Take care.